Thank you. Good afternoon. Okay, this is quite a gathering. It's the first time that I've ever been here, and appreciate the invitation from our elders here to come and speak. I've not seen this many elders all in one roof, I don't guess ever. So this is really something unique and special. Couple of housekeeping things before I start. One is I apologize for my voice. I've been battling some kind of sinus stuff for about 3 weeks, and my voice is just not there. The other thing is my prayer has been to get through this without a coughing episode. If it happens, I promise you I'm not dying. I don't think I'll pass out, but I'll just have to get through it. So anyway, we'll soldier on. The other thing I want to mention is we're talking about change. We're going to be looking at change, especially from a psychological perspective. And part of that is I'm going to assume up front that you're not going to even be considering change if it's not something that's doctrinally sound. And there could be some debates on that, but that's going to be an assumption we're going to be making here. We're not going to get into, at least in my presentation, this is doctrinally sound, that's not. That's something I think that as elders we have to make some of those decisions. But we are going to be talking about how do we handle change. Now let me make sure if I got my clickers all right up here. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about for just a minute, something y'all may have heard before, but it's a knowledge doubling curve. This was really developed by a guy by the name of Fuller. It's been adjusted and kind of worked through the years. But basically, it says that up until the 1900s, human knowledge, our accumulated knowledge, doubled every 100 years, okay? Now, I don't think any of us were alive back then, but, if you talk to your grandfathers, your parents, whatever, you probably that makes some sense. That had changed by 1945. Knowledge was doubling every 25 years, okay? That's quite a change. In 1982, they were saying knowledge was doubling every 12 to 13 months, okay? Look at this next one. They're saying now knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. And this does not take into account AI, which is going to blow everything up, okay? Now, when you stop and think about that, we're living in a time that it's just amazing. And the fact that you'll go to bed, and when you wake up, this human knowledge will have doubled, okay? What used to be, took us 100 years to kind of get settled on, now is something that is happening so quickly. And that contributes to something we call change fatigue, where people just get tired of change. They just reach a point where, oh, this is tough. Another thing that's happened here, okay, in 2007, Steve Jobs introduced that little device up there. Wasn't there when he introduced it, but I remember seeing a recording, and I thought, that is the dumbest thing ever. He said, you can get on the internet, you can check your email. Who wants to do that? I would be content with my little Motorola flip phone. I don't need that. Well, guess what? We've all got that now, right? And we can talk about our kids or our grandkids, but we won't leave home without this. You'd rather leave home without your pants than to leave your phone. The other day I was going to church and I didn't have my phone. Now, I don't need my phone during church, okay? Well, I do have a Bible app on it, but there are other ways of finding Scripture. But I couldn't go to church. The Lord just told me, go back and get your phone. And I had to follow those instructions. Who knows? Trump might have wanted to call me to find out what to do. You never know. Okay, we're going to move through this stuff here. Loss and change. There is an idea that says people do not resist change. They resist the loss that comes along with change. And this is important to remember as we go through how do we handle change, how do we prepare people. It's usually the loss that we have that's associated with that. It's interesting, this loss can either be a perceived loss or it can be a tangible loss. It doesn't have to, what might be a loss for me may not be one for you. So, I'll be sucking on water all through this. So we need to keep in mind loss is different. Now, one of the things that I'm going to kind of point out here is that when we're dealing with matters of faith and tradition, for most of us, those are extremely important losses if we feel like we're losing something there. That hits us very, very deeply, very close to home. So as we're talking about things, we need to always be aware that when we're talking about change, we may have some people that are considering that a loss. There's something called loss aversion, and this has been proven in research that the pain of losing something is twice as strong as the perceived gain of getting something, okay? Now think about that for a minute when we consider that the issue of if we're going to lose something, that hits us a lot stronger than, hey, we may gain something from it. Okay, now it's after lunch, and I'm going to go through this real quick because you're going to doze off on me if I don't. But I want to talk a little bit about the neuroanatomy of loss, okay? When we're dealing with fear, this little thing up in our brain is what kind of really is triggered, the amygdala, okay? We have two of those things. They're little almond-shaped things in our brain. When that is triggered, when there's something that we have a lot of fear on that we're dealing with. So if we're losing something and we're scared about that, then that amygdala can be triggered. It can also be triggered in other things. Now, the interesting thing is, and we're going to talk about it in a second, see this whole big thing up here, the prefrontal cortex? That is our thinking part of our brain. That's our reasoning part of our brain. That's the part that analyzes things and all. The little amygdala is part of the limbic system, and it's just the emotional part. When that's activated, especially if it's a severe activation, this goes offline, our thinking part. It shuts down. Now, as that happens, if it's a real fear response, we usually have three things that are going to occur. One is a fight. We're going to fight. Two is a flight. We're going to get out of there. Or three is a freeze response. We just stop. Okay? And as that's activated, sometimes we're not thinking about it. We're not. The prefrontal cortex just isn't there. Let me give you an example. Now, it's going to be an extreme example, but I got a patient that I'm seeing now. He's in his 30s, a veteran, and he was, back when he was in his 20s, he was getting processed after being over in Iraq or Afghanistan 1. And so he was going through and being processed in a processing center in his fort. As he's standing there, a friend of his walks up and says, man, I'm in a hurry. How long is this line going to be? And my patient said, well, here, cut in front of me. I'm in no rush, anything like that. So he gets in front, and they're visiting, talking. In a few minutes later, a guy walks in who had been radicalized, starts opening fire on them. There's the Fort Hood massacre that you may remember back in, I think it's 2009. That guy that was right in front of him was one of the 13 that was shot and killed, okay? Now, you can imagine what he's feeling. Survivor's guilt. What if that'd been me? I'd let him go and it killed him. Let's talk a little bit about how all that affects him. To this day, and that's been, since 2009, so however many years that's been, if this guy goes in a restaurant, where do you think he wants to sit? Somewhere where his back is to the wall and he can keep an eye on everybody out there. He doesn't like being in big crowds. Now intellectually, he knows that, likelihood of somebody coming in and shooting him or attacking him is not there. But this thing is so strong that it shut this thing down. So when a fear response is that strong, it can really affect our ability to think through things. Now, fortunately, most of the time the people we're working with as elders, it's not that severe. But it can be more severe than sometimes we think of that it should be or is, based on what they're perceiving as loss and how fearful they are of that loss. Okay? Now let's consider a few things we need to consider here as we deal with some of this stuff. One issue to consider is, what is your church's DNA? By that, I'm primarily talking about, what's your church history, okay? We have a rather large church in Fort Worth, not the one I attend, but another one. Their DNA is change. In fact, if you talk to their shepherds or their ministers, they'll tell you, we're constantly changing. We make no promises to anybody that what we're going to be or what we're going to be doing. That's who we are, and that's who they've been for 40-something years. Most of our churches, including mine, are not like that. That is not in our DNA. Our DNA is more traditional. It's more what we've been used to. And if we're talking about change, we need to be considerate of what is that DNA. The second thing we also need to be aware of is this comes something, we call it a window of tolerance. This comes out of trauma research, people who've been traumatized. And the idea is that there is a place here that people are comfortable with. Down here, not so much so, and up here, not so much so. Down here, they call this kind of, boredom and hypoarousal. If your minister gets up and preaches the same sermon Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, your song leader's leading the same songs every Sunday, what are your people probably going to start complaining of? Man, this is kind of boring. We need a little bit of activation and change. On the other hand, if there is just literally too much up here, then that causes anxiety. We're not feeling comfortable. We don't know what to expect, and we're dealing with something in psychological terms, we'd call that hyperarousal. And so we need to be aware, this isn't the congregation, this is your individual members. What is their window of tolerance? Where are they at? And again, we're not talking about doctrinal stuff here. We're talking about some changes that we're okay with there. Okay, kind of moving along, and there's a couple of things we're going to hit here in just a minute. One of the things that I think, and this comes from some of my experiences with churches, that we need to be careful with, is we need to be careful with sometimes taking low-hanging fruit when we're talking about change. Now, what am I talking about with low-hanging fruit? I'm talking about, we've had a situation, let me back up a second. When I became a psychologist, I don't think I ever had any intention of working with elders, other than in my own congregation. I was 20-something years old, and all of a sudden I started having elderships calling saying, can you come visit with us about something like this? And I was way too young probably to be doing that, but as a result of that, it did give me an opportunity to see a bunch of different elderships and how they were processing things, how they were working with things. And we've had some situations in my neck of the woods, in the Metroplex, where we've had churches that have been dealing with what a lot of us has dealt with, and that was during the 90s and 2000s, kind of, attendance dropping some. And so it becomes, what are we going to do? And sometimes some of those churches have decided, look, we need to change. We need to change maybe how we're doing worship. Maybe we need to change how we're doing leadership. We need to make some big, big changes there. Unfortunately, we didn't consider some of these things well enough, maybe the DNA, our history of our church, what our people are comfortable with. And so what has happened sometimes is just the opposite of what they wanted to. The attendance and the congregation is just, they've gone from 500-600 members down to 100 or something in that range. It's real easy to come in and look at some of these low-hanging fruit changes. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot to change worship service, okay? Now, we might not like it, but you can do it. You can go buy you a bunch of microphones, get praise teams up. You can do whatever, and you can do that pretty easy. I'm going to propose that if we're talking about growth, there's some other things that are probably a little bit more important than some of the low-hanging fruit. We had a family that placed membership with us, it's been about 6 months ago. And I remember this family, we were asking them, what brought you to Pleasant Ridge? And what they mentioned, excuse me, was the idea of it's so peaceful. It's so peaceful here. You know, people with all the changes we're talking about are really looking at peace. They want somewhere they can go, that there's not a lot of turmoil, where we can be peaceful. Okay, that handsome man right there. I had Matt back here when I sent these slides, and he said, "What in the world is he doing up there?" And really, you know, I can tell you, I probably, it's kind of a throw-in slide. Y'all know, most of y'all probably recognize that's James Carville, right? The Raging Cajun, as they called him. He was Bill Clinton's chief strategist during Clinton when he won election over the elder Bush. And he had one saying that in their campaign, and it was, "It's the economy, stupid." And that was his way of them focusing on what the important stuff is and not getting sidetracked by things that really aren't all that important. And when I had put that slide in, I thought, well, I can make it, it's the relationship, stupid. And I thought, that's not very respectful. I better not do that. I don't really want to get run out of here. But anyway, I left Carville in there because one thing he did is he kept focus. And we need to be aware, if we're wanting to do this, we need to figure out what really is important to us if we're talking about change. We live in a time that is it has so many challenges and yet has so many opportunities. You know, we had the little iPhone picture up there a while ago. We could spend all afternoon and tomorrow talking about how social media has drastically changed our lives in the church. That's probably one of the biggest change forces that we've had, you know, in our society. And as far as our dealings with it, we've got to be aware of some of that stuff, or we need to be. I think it was 2005, I ran for school board and was on school board for 9 years. What I remember there is we had several crises come up. We had a couple of little darlings that decided it'd be nice to burn the junior high down. And then our fire department didn't have fire hoses long enough to stretch into there and put it out. So we had to deal with some things like that. But what I remember in that time is we had several weeks to figure out what we're going to do, to kind of plan on it and get it started. Now, go forward about 15 years or so, well, not 15, about 10 years, and I decided to run for city council. I'm not a very bright guy. But got on city council. It had drastically changed by that time. By that time, social media was up and going, and when we had a crisis, we had 24 to 48 hours. And if you didn't deal with it, it had taken off and it was going on its own. Now, to some extent, as elders, we've got to be aware that it's not as bad as being on city council or school board, but we got to be aware that's part of the world we live in, where social media, our members are talking out there. And if things come up, we've got to be aware that there's conversations going on out there that we may not be even aware of. Another thing we have to kind of be aware of is there are things going on in the brotherhood that are not a part of our congregation, but it's affecting how our members are feeling about things. I don't know about y'all, but we had a situation where we decided at some point, this has been probably 10, 15 years ago, we were going to have mic'd singers in the audience. We weren't going to do a stand-up praise team. We didn't feel like that was really where we were at. But we had mic'd singers in the audience to break down the different parts of our singing, okay? Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, does it? I mean, you've got several people sitting around with microphones and all, unless somebody starts cutting in on the preacher, maybe. But we had some people we had to deal with. Oh, no. You are doing that. That's the first step to going here, and then here, and then here. Well, that's something we had to be aware of. They're reading the Christian Chronicle. They're getting on blog sites and other things, and all these other churches are doing it, and we're going down that path. So we got to be aware of how social media and all is affecting our people out there, especially when we're talking about change. Okay, and this is, I'm going to get, I guess, maybe a little bit on a soapbox here, but I've certainly become convinced in my work as an elder and as a psychologist that really when we get down to it, this is what's important. You know, it's not fog machines, it's not laser shows, it's not doing, weird things in worship. If we're really wanting to grow and to see our churches do what we need to be doing, we need to be aware that it's about relationships, it's about connection. People are desperate for that right now. That's what they're really looking for. It's something that's difficult. Now, I'm going to go in line. Mike Pipkin up here said that there was one elder. They only had a business meeting every month and a half. Now, I know some of y'all think that your church would just dry up and couldn't make it if you did that. I'm the elder that told him that. That's been an evolution we've gone through for 10 years. We didn't start off there, but we really do have a business meeting. Our business meeting is every other month. For us, that works. Now, it might not where you're at, but we have really made some decisions that this is going to be what we're going to be focusing on. We're really going to be focusing on relationships, getting into people's lives, in the community, and in the church. And I think we at times had a lot of good plans for what we were going to be changing and all, and God showed us those aren't going to work for you. They just didn't work. And I think this has been where we've been led, and is something that I think we all need to be thinking about. Connectivity is really, really important. Okay. It goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway. Obviously, if we're going to be making changes, we need to be aware and be praying about it. Like I said a few minutes ago, in our congregation, we've had some really great plans that we all thought was a really good thing to do. We prayed about it, prayed for God to show us, and He didn't take us down that road. And there have been other roads that probably we wouldn't have thought we would have gone that He's shown us. But I think we can't ever forget that we need to be in prayer about what we're doing before we make a decision to do it sometimes. Okay. Let's say we've weighed the costs and the benefits, and we've decided we need to do change. Now, how do we implement change? How do we do it in a way that makes some sense and hopefully works for our folks and works for us? Let's spend a few minutes kind of talking about that. I think the first thing we need to do is make sure the leadership, that we're all together. And by leadership, I think we're talking about elders, we're talking about ministers. They're part of the leadership team. I never will forget one time I had a church call me and said, Dr. Walker, can you come do some team building stuff for us? And we're going to do an elder retreat and have our minister there and do some team building. And I said, sure. So we planned on some team building activities and all, and we went to this off-site place. And the first night I was there, I found out they didn't need team building. That was a fractured eldership. It was an eldership that was really, they were in two camps. And they were very diametrically opposed to each other. And they were angry at each other. They were attributing what the other side thought about things. And very, very hurtful and dysfunctional there. Spent some time with them, did what we could. I don't know, I didn't have a follow-up, so I don't know whatever happened. My last point with them was, y'all have got to reconcile, and if you can't, then you may have to look at maybe it's not a great time for y'all to be elders, you know. Maybe we need to do something there. We've got to make sure that if we're embarking on something, we're all together. Unity, I don't think we can overemphasize unity. Now, depending on the size of your eldership, that may be a very easy, natural thing, or it may become more difficult. Our eldership is larger than typical. We've gone through a series of changes moving us to where we are. We're a congregation of about 600 in attendance, probably about 1,000 in membership. We have another 100 online. We've got 21 elders, okay, which is more than typical. For the way if we were doing a traditional eldership, that would be way too many people to have in there. The way we've structured our eldership and what we've gone through, we need that many because we're doing some things different than we ever did before in terms of our involvement in people's lives and all. But one of the issues there is how do we keep 21 people together and in line and working together? And that's a continuing thing we have to work on and be aware of and move toward. An organization will never go higher than its leadership goes. It just won't do it. If we're not out there and healthy and working together, then that church is just it's gonna have some problems. Okay. We need to work, if we're going to do change, we need to work on preparing the church for that. And you've heard some great ideas in some of the other presentations about that, about how do you do that. I mean, obviously there we're talking about communication, okay? We're talking about how do we communicate with people and let them know what's coming up. No surprises. We don't do good with surprises. How can we do that and have our people prepared for that? Now, I've been to a lot of continuing education workshops. Have to as a psychologist. My feeling is if you can get one thing out of a workshop that someone's speaking, it's probably been worthwhile. And those of you that have been to some of those, sometimes that happens and sometimes you don't get anything worthwhile out of it. But if you're dozing off, this is a good time to wake up because I'm going to give you the one thing in my lesson here that's going to be the key for you, okay? So when you leave here today and you're worried about how do I communicate change to your congregation, this is going to be it. So wake up, I'm going to tell you this, and then you can go back to sleep when I'm finished with it. And I think the best way for me to describe this is to tell the story behind it, okay? We had a situation, a great little family. He was a deacon in the church, a Bible school teacher in one of our larger adult classes, and just a really sweet family. We were making a change in our, this was after COVID, and we were going from 2 services to 1 service. And bless he and his wife's heart, they had some real heartburn over that. And the eldership had kind of already decided, we've got to do this. This is what we feel like this is what we need to do. So we told the congregation, and they were really struggling with it. I won't go into all the details. There were some other things behind that. But they decided we can't attend here anymore. We're going to have to leave. And so I attended the class where he was at. And it became my duty, because none of the other elders wanted to do it, to make the announcement to the congregation, to the class, why he wasn't going to be there anymore. And I really struggled with that. I wanted them to understand we still love these folks. They're welcome back should they ever want to. This wasn't disfellowshipping anybody or anything like that. But they had a matter of conscience that they felt strongly about, and which is their right, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so, man, I struggle with that. I wrote things and rewrote them, bounced ideas off my wife. She'd say, no, that's too harsh. No, that you need to be more upfront than that. And I worked hard on that. My job to get up and make the announcement and then teach the class. Okay? So I get up, I make the announcement. I teach the class. Nobody got mad and stood up and left or anything like that. Afterwards, I had a few people say, appreciate you doing that. And so I'm feeling pretty good about it. My wife walks up to me, and my thought was she's going to come up and say, you did a good job on that. You appreciate that. She leans over to me and says, your fly is unzipped. Now, I did check before I came in here to make sure that wasn't. Now, this is my key. I don't think anybody else has ever developed this strategy. But what I figured out was some of the people that were watching that thought that poor old guy, bless his heart, he can't get dressed. We need to give him a lot of grace and extend a lot of that. So, my take home for you is, if you've got to make an announcement that may be difficult, leave your fly unzipped. Okay? Oh, I couldn't believe that. Okay. We also, if we're doing something, obviously there are big changes and there are little changes. Our congregation, I mentioned we do our eldership a little bit differently than we used to, and probably than most churches do now. That's an internal change we made. It was not a big deal to the congregation. They don't see some of that. So we've not made that a big deal. But if we're, depending on how big a deal the change is, we need to be available for questions. That doesn't probably need to be or should be in a corporate forum. But we need to be able to encourage our members. If you have any questions, come and talk to us, okay? We'd welcome a chance to talk to you. People like to know the door's open to converse and all. Remember back when I said earlier, this part of our brain that thinks shuts down when it's just emotion? One way of getting this thinking part re-engaged is to talk to people. We do that in therapy when we're dealing with somebody who's going through traumatic situations. So one thing we can always do is be available to discuss things, be available to talk to others. There's sometimes, where we may need to also pull other key members in our congregation and give them a heads up. I had a church come to me one time, and I was pretty familiar with this church, and there was some dysfunctional things going on with the deacons and elders. The deacons, there were several deacons there that were younger. They didn't really appreciate the way the elders were doing some things. They felt like the elders are self-perpetuating. Several of them felt like they needed to be elders, and that hadn't happened. And there was just some tension going on there. Meanwhile, a minister was hired. He'd been there for about 3 or 4 years, and he had kind of aligned himself with the deacons that wanted change. So there was kind of this undercurrent of, elders, don't you hold him back. He's wanting to make some changes in the church. And some of those changes the elders weren't real comfortable with. Well, as this thing played out, the preacher was having an affair with somebody in the church, okay, which can kind of happen sometimes more than we'd like it to. And so the eldership asked me to come in, and they were talking through this, and the eldership had decided they were going to have to let the guy go, which was, in this situation, the right thing to do. But their concern was, is it's going to really tear the church apart with these other deacons over here that very much are kind of been in his camp. And so one of the things we talked about, and in this situation it worked, was before this thing's announced or goes further, you guys need to go talk to those 2 or 3 key guys there and bring them in on what's going on here and let them know that we're at a point where, you know, something's got to be done. This is what we're going to have to do. They did that. The deacons understood that. They knew that was kind of out of bounds. And so it all went as well as it could. That was not a great thing for a church to go through something like that, but it was something that they managed to kind of get through and get a heads up on. So sometimes having these other people that were able to give them a heads up is kind of important. And then the last thing here is that if you've really made a decision, this is best for the church, you've prayed about it, you really feel strongly this is where you're going, then stay the course. It's very, very rare that everybody agrees with every decision, okay? That's just, unfortunately, that doesn't happen a whole lot. There's always some people that think, well, I really wish y'all would do something a little bit different. I wish we'd go a different direction than this. But there are times we as leaders have to make decisions and stay. There is something comforting to a congregation when eldership are willing to take the lead and move on something. And so sometimes, you know, like we did with the situation where we went from 2 services to 1 service, this is what we've decided to do, what we feel like is really best to do, and we really, really need to move forward with that. There was a fellow, when I was in Rotary Club, we had a Methodist minister that was in Rotary Club, and he and I would go out to set flags up or do some of the things we did at that point, and we'd talk about churches. You know, what's going on in churches and all that sort of thing. What was really interesting is other denominations are going through a lot of things that are very, very similar to what we have gone through. There's not a lot of new things out there. And I remember one time we were talking, and he said, Mike, he said, you know, he said, I really do appreciate the Church of Christ. He said, for this reason. He said, the Church of Christ is so respectful of biblical authority, number one. You know, if it's in the Bible, then you guys pretty much stick to it. He said the second thing that you guys are really, really good at is, he said, your people generally follow your eldership if your eldership leads them. He said, you know, that's something, he said, as a Methodist, he said, it's like herding cats in the Methodist church. He said, you know, they're going every which way. And he said, I really do appreciate that. And it really made me think that sometimes we need to appreciate what we do have. That by and large, we have a group of people that wants us to be leaders. They want to go in the direction that we lead them. They sometimes need us to just be leaders and head out there. So as we kind of draw this to a close, I think from where I'm at as somebody that has worked with different churches and all, I think several things are kind of important. You know, number one is we've got to realize our traditions and that people have a limit for change. And if you go over that limit, they're going to vote with their feet, okay? Number two is the unity situation is critical. If you have a fractured eldership, you're going to have a fractured church. And before we do anything, we got to get that. And then the third thing is we got to focus on relationships. We've got to focus on that connectivity. People are desperate for that since COVID. There are some opportunities we had. We kind of talked about that last night, that we have opportunities now in the church that we didn't have 10 years ago. We have challenges that are kind of messy to work with, but we have a lot of opportunities there. And we need to probably be focusing on what opportunities we've got and really be targeted on what changes we make and what other changes we need to stay away from. Okay, I'm really excited. Number one, y'all nobody made fun of me with the fly thing. Number two is I didn't get a coughing fit or anything like that. So with that, I think I'm going to end right now. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.